Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new season of Front Row here on Economy.lk, where we will interview key personalities and experts in the business and economic fields to get their perspectives and views for you tuning in on this show. Today we have with us Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, who is the Executive Director at the Institute of Policy Studies, here speaking to us on Front Row. Welcome Dr. Dushni and thank you for joining in. So let me get straight into some of the key questions. And the economy is obviously right now a key topic of concern, with a lot of people wondering in particular how 2022 is going to turn out. To allay some of these fears, we did see a roadmap put out by the central bank in early October. We did see the budget in November. Has these kind of allayed some of the fears, or what can we expect for 2022?
My sense, Shiran, is that 2022 is going to be another difficult year, and perhaps even more difficult than this year, because at least in 2021 there was a recovery from the downturn of the previous year. But for 2022, it's we are back to pre-pandemic output levels and trying to then grow on that, and that's not easy when you look at the fiscal numbers and the overall framework suggests that interest rates will edge up because the government is planning to borrow heavily from the domestic market, and that will have impacts on growth. It will have spillover impacts on their revenue estimates, etc. So the policy documents that I see, they offer in a sense actions for the short term. The budget, for instance, talks about the one-off taxes, but we don't get a sense of medium-term fiscal consolidation plan that builds one year on to the other. Similarly, the central bank's roadmap is, it's trying to explain how the financing gaps will be bridged by tapping swap arrangements and short-term credit lines, etc. So likely to be a very, very tough environment for businesses and private sector in 2022, with a lot of uncertainty hanging over our heads about exchange rate policy and how the government will manage to lift the lid on that, but ensure that it's done in a sort of orderly fashion as well.
Building on that and the key external debt risk that you were talking about, we're hearing various policy options, prescriptions for the government to really maneuver this. Of course, the government is talking about their own homegrown solution. What do you really think are some of the more viable options for Sri Lanka to really face this? As you mentioned, it's not only a one-year thing, it's consecutive years that we need to face this in the next few years.
Yes, I mean, this question has, come up. In 2020, we asked ourselves, will there be a debt default? In 2021, we asked the same thing, and now 2022. So, and that in itself tells us that there hasn't been a set of policy measures that have been put forward as a long-term solution for the for this problem. So the one thing that is clear is that Sri Lanka's policy options are narrowing each day, until and unless we put a credible set of proposals on how we intend to address this in the medium term. For 2022, what are the options? So either the first is that the government goes along what it's been doing, and that is looking for foreign exchange inflows from wherever possible, swaps, credit lines, divesting some of state-owned entities, etc., and then meeting the international sovereign bond obligations. The SLDBs, etc., domestic investors can be brought onto a negotiating table, and all of that may be rolled over. But sovereign bonds, it's not so easy. Second option that they could have done was to put forward a credible fiscal policy process in November, taking a 3-year framework and testing the waters, international capital markets, about their appetite for investing in Sri Lanka once again. Now, we don't have such policy framework in hand, unfortunately. I think the budget fell short of that. The third option then is to continue to try and bridge financing gaps wherever possible, but at the same time try and build a safety net, start talks with the IMF, not necessarily on debt restructuring, but as balance of payment support, so that at any point we have a shortage of dollars, then that IMF program can be tapped to provide some degree of confidence to investors also that there is a plan and that we will at the end of 2 years or 3 years see a turnaround and an improvement in the current outlook. But again, those decisions have to be made quickly because we are without much room to play around.
Sure. Going beyond these short-term risks, which are in itself very severe, taking a more medium to long-term view, especially in terms of growth, what are probably the top 2 to 3 things that Sri Lanka needs to do or policymakers need to do to really, I'm sure we'll see a growth jump this year from the contraction in 2020. But beyond that, to get to the 5-6% growth level, what are some of the key reforms that needs to be done in this backdrop of external debt issues?
For us to continue to grow in 2022, I mean, you can do that without reforms. If the government gets its hands on foreign direct investment that comes into construction, into some big projects, that will stimulate growth. But that's a kind of growth process that may not be sustainable beyond 2 to 3 years. So to come back to the kind of growth, medium, long-term, sustained growth, that I think is something that requires policies that will bring about a structural transformation, move our workers out of agriculture into services and industry, and there we come back to lifting the lid on restrictions on imports, looking at how the export sector can be helped, strategic sectors that they can enter, look for new markets, etc. And to complement that, you have to look at all the supply side constraints that are holding back export sector, the high utility costs, energy costs, the high wage costs, etc. But these are long-term, the benefits will come only in the long term, and I think in the middle of an electoral cycle as we are now, we are unlikely to see those kinds of big reforms. More likely it will be sort of a short-term view on the next 2-3 years. What can we do? Again, simply removing a lot of these regulatory restrictions, introducing more digital sort of digitization into our public service deliveries. All of these can help cut costs and keep our exporters competitive.
There you heard it. I think we've covered 3 interesting areas. The first 2 in particular on the debt, external debt situation, how Sri Lanka can really navigate it, and what are some of the options. I think we've heard a lot about this debt issue, but Dr. Dushni has simplified and explained some of it in terms of the options available for Sri Lanka. Then we shifted to the more medium to long-term reforms, where she illustrated there is limited room to do big reforms, but there might be small spaces where actionable reforms could take place so that growth goes back to a sustainable path. So thank you, Dr. Dushni, for joining on this episode of Front Row. And to our viewers, stay tuned for future episodes like this. Thank you.